Discerning Hearts provides content dedicated to those on the spiritual journey. To continue production of these videos, prayers, and more, go to discerninghearts.com and click the donate link found there or inside the free Discerning Hearts app to make your donation. Thanks, and God bless.
DiscerningHearts.com presents Inside the Pages, insights from today's most compelling authors. I'm your host, Kris McGregor, and I am delighted to be joined by Dan LeRoy, an author, journalist, and teacher who is director of the Writing and Publishing Department at Lincoln Park Performing Arts Charter School in Midland, Pennsylvania. His writing about music and politics has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Newsweek, The Village Voice, Alternative Press, Esquire, and the National Review Online. With Dan LeRoy, we go inside the pages of Why We Think What We Think, The Rise and Fall of Western Thought, published by Sophia Institute Press. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to get to speak to you today. Really looking forward to it.
I am too, because your book, I took some time to dwell with it, not just to race through it. And I learned so much more. And I guess that's what good philosophers do. They not only, they teach you more than knowledge. They help to provide wisdom, right? Because that's philosophy.
Certainly true.
The love of wisdom. But I don't know if everybody has that love. And I'm not trying to be pretentious to say I do, but when you encounter it, it really is attractive.
Well, I'm grateful to you for saying that and for not racing through it. As we were just mentioning a few moments ago, that is the way of all things these days, and it's one of the reasons that a book about philosophy is a tough sell for a lot of people. It's not as instant as we might like. It does, I think, require a little bit of digging in, and that kind of goes against the grain of our society over the last 150 years or thereabouts.
I think why your book is so important, and again, it's why we think what we think, the rise and fall of Western thought, is because critical thinking and understanding what's happening in our world today. I don't want to even just say our culture, but throughout the world today, that needs to be established. Because I think everyone, I don't think it's an understatement or an overstatement to say that people are scratching their heads and said, what has become of us? Is that fair?
I think it's more than fair. And one of the reasons for writing this book is that philosophy deserves some amount of blame for that situation. And philosophy, as I try to talk about in the book, philosophy has done everything in its power, again, over the last century and a half or so, to try to make itself irrelevant. And one of the byproducts of making itself irrelevant is that most people today now think of it as a joke. It's not a serious thing. It's only the sort of thing that you would do if you want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to educate yourself in college for a discipline that has no value in the real world. And as a result of that, philosophy and philosophers, especially the modern and contemporary ones, have really been allowed to skate for a lot of the damage that they are at least in part responsible for. So one of the reasons for writing the book is to try to hold some of these people and some of these ideas to account for what they are responsible for doing.
Yeah, I always have to remind myself, it's because of ideas that took root even over 100 years ago, in particular, that created the isms that affect our world today. It starts with an idea. It starts with a thought. And so how those are structured, how the basis, the principle of how we approach our thinking, it does have huge ramifications. It can on a global scale, but it also can in the family.
Well, and the family is a great thing to mention, because the prevailing project of philosophers, again, over really here we're going back to the beginnings of the modern era, and we can date that back as far as 500 years ago or so. But the prevailing project has been the liberation of the individual. It has been that project has been approached in many, many different ways through many, many different philosophers, but that is the overarching goal of philosophy over the last 5 centuries. And the liberation of the individual from every other constraint, from God, from the church, from family, as you mentioned, from any and all responsibilities, making it purely voluntary. Everything I do is my choice. It's not because I have a responsibility to do it. I'm responsible only to myself. The effect of that is the root of every other problem that we spend our time talking about. And it's a variety of problems. We don't have enough time today to run through all of them, but the root of all of it is this rampant individualism. And where does that idea come from? It comes from a variety of philosophers, many of whom are very, in as much as anybody respects a philosopher these days, very well respected philosophers. A good example of that is John Locke, a guy who, if he's known at all, is known as really the architect of Western democracy. He's the guy who inspired Thomas Jefferson. There's no Declaration of Independence without John Locke. So John Locke had a lot of attractive ideas, but within a lot of those attractive ideas is this thing that we're talking about, the idea that our project is to liberate the individual. And John Locke came up with a lot of things, which I think if most people knew them, they would say, wow, that's really crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, again, part of the project of this book, is to trace some of these ideas back to their source, because I think you don't fix the idea unless you know first where it came from and how it got to the place where it is right now. You got to trace these things back to the root. Cut the head off the hydra, and there's a lot of heads here that we're talking about, but we got to go back to where it starts.
When you do that in the beginning of the book, I mean, I think for most people, when we think of philosophy, we think of guys with beards and curly hair and long robes, white robes. And of course, we're talking about the ancient Greeks, who you point out in the book as we begin this journey. Greece, its stability, its prosperity, it essentially helped kickstart philosophy, didn't it?
It did. And one of the sad things about all this is, if this kind of caricature of the philosopher that we're talking about, if we actually knew what, in particular, the big three, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, if we knew what they said and actually followed it more closely, we'd be in so much better shape than we would be with some of the ideas that have been propagated by their heirs throughout the centuries. So one of the first and biggest mistakes in philosophy is trying to cut ourselves off from this very, very rich source of ideas, which begins, as you say, in classical Greece, which it's a stable society, it's a prosperous society, it's the first society where there's really an opportunity to devote time, at least in the West, to these ideas. And that's why philosophy emerges there instead of in other places.
Well, you mentioned those who were influenced by the big three. Again, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And of course, as Catholic philosophers who really laid the foundation going in that we consider the West, I mean, you would say that St. Augustine, yes, St. Thomas Aquinas. Absolutely. How were they influenced by that?
They were influenced by them in many ways, but I would say two that are most significant. First of all, even though in the case of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, we're talking about pre-Christian philosophers, so they did not have the same idea of a Christian God, obviously, as Augustine and Aquinas and the later Catholic philosophers. But what they did have was this idea that human beings exist for a purpose. We do have some reason to be here. And in the case of all three of these guys, they more or less agree on the particulars that the purpose of human beings, because we are the only creatures who are endowed with reason, our purpose then is to seek the truth and to gather knowledge. And we are gathering knowledge because to gather knowledge is part of our purpose. It's not knowledge as a means to an end. It's knowledge because to know will make us more virtuous. And we're going to be more virtuous because we're fulfilling our obligation as human beings. And that's an idea that it was very easy for the Christian philosophers, Augustine, Aquinas, to take and adapt into the Christian form, because clearly that's what we believe as Christians. We just happen to believe in particular that, as Aquinas said, God made the world. He made it in a way that is intelligible. There are things that we can know about it, and therefore it is our responsibility to seek the truth. That truth is the knowledge of our Creator and the world that He created. That's our job. And if we do this, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all said, and the later Catholic philosophers agreed with them, if we do this, we're going to be happy. We're not going to be happy if we do any other thing. And was just looking at a survey very recently, and it's one of those happiness surveys, and I think the tagline was, the United States has fallen out of the top 20 countries in terms of overall happiness for the first time since they've been doing this study for the last 10 or 15 years. And we've all heard this in various forms. We have all this material prosperity. We are living in a way that the ancients would have thought was greater than kings, and yet everybody is unhappy. Why are we unhappy? The big three would have said, Augustine would have agreed, Aquinas would have agreed, we're unhappy because we are not fulfilling our obligation as human beings. And until we make that our goal, we're always going to be unhappy.
That's the thing for the Christian philosopher, particularly the Catholic one. We're given the guidance of what our goal is, where we're going, who we are, what we're created in the image of. But for the Greeks, they didn't necessarily have that type of moral guidance, did they? Or that it was more about myth for them in some ways.
It was, but actually I'm glad you said that, because I realized after that long stem winder of an answer that I only really talked about one thing. And the second thing is kind of what you just mentioned, that the big three, while they did not have this Christian moral framework, they did believe that virtue is important. And even if they approached it in a slightly different way than the later Catholic philosophers, they still believed that, again, virtue is part of this responsibility of the human being. And all of these things are tied up. Purpose equals being virtuous. So what does it mean to be virtuous? Well, it means you can't be virtuous unless you're seeking the truth. And you have to seek the truth to be happy. So all of these things are related. And if you leave one step of it out, then the end result is you're not going to be virtuous, you're not going to be fulfilling your obligation, and therefore you're going to be unhappy. And again, that idea of virtue, and Aristotle famously talks about virtue in his idea of the golden mean, that between the two extremes of every kind of behavior, there is a behavior in the middle which is going to be virtuous. If you're too brave, it means you're foolhardy. If you're not brave enough, it means you're too timid, you're cowardly. But in the middle of that is the right amount of bravery, which is virtuous. So they definitely had an idea of virtue that was easy for the later Catholic philosophers to adopt. It's only when we get to the modern philosophers that we start talking about trying to divorce ourselves from this idea that virtue is important. Virtue, once again, becomes a completely individual matter. And once it becomes a completely individual matter, we get to that place where we are and have been for a while, which is, well, I say for me to be virtuous is to do this thing that makes me happy or seems to make me happy. And even if that's prescribed by society, even if it's prescribed by the church or my community, I'm going to do an end around and get past these guys because my happiness is the most important thing. Of course, happiness in a very temporary and fleeting way. Nobody ever does this stuff and ends up happy for the rest of our lives. We got the survey numbers to prove it.
Well, you do help us in why we think what we think, to help us understand how those Christian philosophers, again, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and a number of others actually, that would help us to make that bridge to where true happiness is. I mean, when you hear this talk about the search for truth and the true happiness, you philosophers are so Dominican in so many ways. It sounds like, because that's their goal, isn't it?
Well, it is, but it also makes me think of, you can go to any library, whether a physical library, online library, Amazon, and you can look for books about happiness. And if you expand that to not just books, but podcasts and other forms of media, there is an almost limitless supply of these things out there. How can I become truly happy? And it's very, very clear, these things don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because people are unhappy and they're looking for happiness. But as you put it, the deal breaker comes when somebody tells you, well, what it really is you have to seek the truth. And the truth also means that you're going to be obligated to make some commitments. You don't get to choose everything in life. There are some things that are chosen for you. And that's where a lot of people get off the bus, because that contravenes everything that we spend most of our lives being inundated with. It's all about you. It's all about what you want. It's all about, do you decide what commitments you keep? Again, same thing. It's about you, the individual. And it's very surprising that we live in this completely atomized society, which again is the work of a lot of these modern philosophers, and nobody is able to see it right in front of them, or when it is put right in front of them, they say, well, now, if that's what you mean I have to do, well, then I don't know if I can do that.
Well, the wisdom that comes from that particular, I hate to call it a branch, I don't know else, but that branch of philosophy, the Augustine, the Thomas Aquinas, is that it is the remedy for when the individual is going to hit the wall of suffering, because you're not always happy when you're suffering. And sometimes in trying to avoid working through that, or that allowing that suffering in some way to have meaning, whether it's the letting go of certain things or it's the sacrificing for another, whatever that may entail, it isn't always going to make you happy.
That's a great point. And in as much as we can say that the project of modern philosophy is the liberation of the individual, when we say that, one of the things we're really saying is the liberation of the individual from suffering. And if you look at everything that has occurred over the last 5 centuries, and to be fair, certainly there have been great scientific advances. There have been technological advances that let us live in ways that, again, materially, physically, are much more comfortable, much more safe. I mean, there are certainly good things. I don't want to sound like I'm advocating that we return to, wholesale to the feudal era, the medieval era, but this is chasing after project that is not achievable. It is impossible to liberate the individual from suffering. And one of the reasons, I think, for the unhappiness of the modern world is we've spent 500 years on this project. We've made a lot of advances, and yet this idea that we're doing this all to liberate the individual from suffering doesn't work. And nothing but unhappiness can come from a project that is flawed from the outset. And that's what the modern philosophical project is. It's baked into the DNA. This is never going to work.
And the thing is, its turn, of course, from the Enlightenment, that turning point was fed essentially by Catholic intellectualism. It was Catholics themselves, Descartes, Kant. They're responsible for those major consequences of that shift.
It's one of the this is a story in this book, but it's a tragic story in many, many ways. I had to look pretty hard to find the happy ending at the end of it. I think there is one, but it is not necessarily apparent to everyone. But the tragic part of it is, as you say, that a lot of the people, and you could go all the way back to William of Ockham, who I lay a lot of the blame for this on, right. Which is not necessarily a view that's shared by everyone, but some of the people who did the most damage to philosophy and thereby to society happen to be Catholic philosophers. And in some cases, at least, I do believe they believed they were doing the right thing. History has shown that, I think, in almost every case, the people that we're talking about, I think they were mistaken, but I do think a lot of them were well-intentioned. Descartes is a good example, and Descartes certainly had an interesting life, but by all accounts, he was by his own lights anyway, he was a fairly devout Catholic, and he really seemed to believe that what he was doing was, look, I am preserving the faith, I'm protecting it from these encroachments upon it. But you can't wall off the faith and protect it. That's not how it works. So once again, that's a project that's flawed from the very beginning. Either the faith runs through everything or it doesn't run through anything. And unfortunately, in the wake of Descartes, it's been the latter option that has been more true.
Well, Dan, your book, Why We Think What We Think, The Rise and Fall of Western Thought, I think is so important. And I know I'm going to have to let you go pretty soon because I know you're a busy guy, but I do have to touch upon, given that split, can you just, this is a big question, but can you give us a sense of the damage it has done to Catholic teachings?
Well, when you talk about the split, what we're, I think, talking about mostly is the move away from Aquinas in particular, but also Aristotle. One of Aquinas's greatest accomplishments, and he has a lot of them, but probably the most significant is he's able to take Aristotle's work, which has been rediscovered at this time. We're talking in the early parts of the 12th to 13th centuries, this stuff has been missing to the West for centuries, and then it is recovered. And then it's the work of the Catholic philosophers of the time, as well as the Jewish and the Islamic philosophers, but it's the work of Catholics who are getting this stuff really for the first time. We have to figure out a way to square this with Christian teaching. And the greatest of all the people, I believe, and a lot of people believe who did that, is St. Thomas Aquinas. But part of doing that means that now the church is aligned with Aristotle. And Aristotle, certainly one of the handful of greatest philosophers of all time, Aristotle, like all the people of his time, he made a lot of mistakes. He probably couldn't have known any better. Of course, the most famous one is the idea about what revolves around what, but he made a lot of other errors just because, the science was not fully developed at this time. And so part of what happens, this split that you're talking about, is people use the fact that Aristotle is mistaken in some of his conclusions to say, well, if he's mistaken and St. Thomas Aquinas based his work on the work of Aristotle, therefore St. Thomas Aquinas's work is also invalid, so let's throw it out. And this has propagated this idea, and everybody kind of knows this as received knowledge. Well, this is why science proved that Aquinas in particular, and the Catholic Church generally, science proved it was wrong. No, it didn't. What happened is that it was very convenient to throw this stuff out. And why did we throw Aquinas and Aristotle out? We threw it out at the beginning of the modern era because we didn't want it, not because we proved that it was wrong. No one has ever disproved, for example, any of St. Thomas's 5 ways. They've tried very hard, 5 ways to prove the existence of God. No one has ever disproven that. They have certainly mischaracterized it, taken it out of context, labored very, very hard to show the mistakes in it. But that's one of the great fallacies of philosophy, is that St. Thomas Aquinas's work was invalidated by science. No, it wasn't. Nobody yet has come to grips fully with the stuff that he had to say. And this, on the basis of this mistaken idea, we have, the concept across society that, the church had its run, but then science came along and wiped it off the map. Of course, ignoring, as I think you alluded to earlier, like there wouldn't be any science if it weren't for the Catholic Church. All of these guys who invented this stuff and perfected it in the medieval period were the scholastics. So we wouldn't be talking about any of this stuff if not for the Catholics at that time. But that split, well, once we abandon Aquinas, once we abandon Aristotle for the sake of convenience, not because they've been disproven, then it's a long, slippery slope all the way down to where we find ourselves right now. And we'd like to think we're at the bottom of it, but I'm not sure that that is actually true.
No, all you have to do, right, is to look at the conversation about the natural law. And oh my gosh. Yeah. And not only, first it was philosophy that laid the groundwork for the natural law because science wasn't there yet. And now science there, and now it's a type of philosophy that is trying to say science is wrong. And I mean, it's mind-boggling. I mean, you talk about going down the spiral down the hill. Now you've got this pile, this mosh pit of pain.
It's a nice image, yes.
I mean, it's just become a mess.
Well, it has. But the one thing that, and it's an unpleasant thing for a lot, is that we have to remember, like we got. And it sounds unfair to people who are like, hey, wait a second, I was born 20 years ago. I didn't have anything to do with this. Well, we're all responsible for this. And part of the reason we're responsible for it is because of the ideas of these philosophers. Even if we don't know what the ideas are, we've absorbed them by osmosis through society. And again, that's part of the reason for writing this book, is to acquaint people with these ideas that they've sort of taken by proxy. People may say that philosophers are stupid and philosophy is a dumb academic exercise, and yet they are living the lives that these philosophers have prepared for them. And if they want to do anything to stop it, they need to go back to where these ideas came from and say, oh, wow, I guess that was the first mistake, and maybe we'd better fix this first mistake.
Learn to think and take one of your philosophy classes and read your book. That's a beginning.
Well, I would say that, but very nice of you.
I'll say it, okay? I think that's so important. Well, this has just been a delight. Dan, I wish we had more time, but I hope you'll come back and we can talk about other topics if you're open to it.
I would be delighted to come back whenever to talk about whatever. It's certainly been a great pleasure for me, and I look forward to returning.
Any final thoughts?
I think the final thoughts, other than well, I'll say this. I'll save the commercial for the very, very end. Final thoughts are, and again, I mentioned the happy ending earlier. There is a happy ending. It's not really an ending. It's the end of the book, but certainly not an ending as such. The happy idea is that over the last 150 years, one of the mistakes that we have started slowly to correct is realizing, both within the church and outside of the church, that St. Thomas Aquinas got abandoned way, way too fast, and actually is a source of great wisdom that we need to recover. And that starts in the middle-ish of the 19th century with Pope Leo XIII, who wrote an encyclical about recovering this knowledge of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's continued throughout the 20th century. I mentioned some people in the book: Gertrude Anscombe, which a lot of people believe is the greatest female philosopher who ever lived. The last guy mentioned, Alasdair MacIntyre, who I believe is the only philosopher mentioned in the book who's still living. These are people who became converts, and they became converts. I'm talking about Anscombe and MacIntyre. They became converts in part because of the work of St. Thomas. They looked at what Aquinas had to say and realized, hey, this is the truth. MacIntyre is probably the best story. You know, he wrote an entire book called After Virtue, and it's only after writing the book that he kind of comes around and Thomistic philosophy, it's inevitable. And so he not only becomes a Thomist, but he actually becomes a convert. And this is a guy who dabbled in every kind of modern philosophy. He was a Marxist. He was an analytic philosopher. He looked at all of these areas, and it was in looking at the work of Aquinas that in part convinced him to become a convert. So it's proof, I think, that if people this smart, Gertrude Anscombe, Alasdair MacIntyre, people who are orders of magnitude smarter than me, if these people can be convinced by the work of Thomas Aquinas, then it's possible for other people as well. So the way to leave things is that if people actually are willing to go back and look at this stuff and re-examine some of these preconceived ideas, they may find that there is something here. And when I say people, I'm also talking about some people from within the Catholic Church as well. There are some number of bishops and other clergy that I believe would benefit from taking a closer look, maybe first look, in some cases, at St. Thomas and what he had to say. So that's the final thought. Hope is out there. It's not going to be easy, but the first step is to acquaint ourselves with the story. And then, you know, what I hope happens if people read this book as they go and they look at, this is only the beginning of something. This is only to point you in the direction of going and looking at the work of these philosophers. Ultimately, that's what has to happen, I think, and St. Thomas in particular.
That love of wisdom that you're passing on to the rest of us takes a particular gift. I mean, you and Dr. Peter Kraft and so many others who are able to help us to and encourage us, to coach us into this seeking out of truth, I think is invaluable for the church today. And I'm just so grateful that we are able to bring your work forward and to allow people to be able to grow in that. So I'm so grateful. I've said it a couple of times now. How many times? I haven't counted, but it's sincere.
Well, and I certainly thank you sincerely for those two wonderful compliments you just gave me. One, to compare me to Dr. Kraft, who, you know, that's what anybody who works in this field, that's a comparison that is incredibly flattering. I got a long way to go to be in that league, but I certainly appreciate being mentioned in the same sentence. But I certainly appreciate that, that you would group me in to that group of people, because no matter what has been said about philosophy, no matter what damage has been done to it, it is important. It's not a silly thing. People have done silly things in the name of philosophy, but that, in the same way that Aquinas shouldn't be discounted on the basis of some scientific inaccuracies of Aristotle's, philosophy shouldn't be disqualified on the basis of some very silly contemporary people who I don't even think took the genre very seriously to begin with. So it's a great honor to be thought of in that company. And now we just got to try to reclaim it for the sane and the sensible.
Yeah, and then we can help those who aren't. So,
but talk about your lifetime projects.
There you go. That would be a life well spent.
I agree.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and I hope we'll get to talk again sometime soon.
Me too. With Dan LeRoy, we've gone inside the pages of Why We Think What We Think, The Rise and Fall of Western Thought. To learn more about this book or to obtain a copy, go to sophiainstitute.com, the website for its publisher, Sophia Institute, or you can find it at any fine Catholic bookstore. To hear and or to download this conversation, along with hundreds of other spiritual formation programs, visit discerninghearts.com, or you can find it within the free Discerning Hearts app or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. We hope that if this program's been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, which is to offer authentic and rock-solid spiritual formation freely to souls around the world. And if you feel us worthy, please consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about discerninghearts.com and join us next time for Inside the Pages, insights from today's most compelling authors.